You're nothing but a glorified Band-Aid dispenser who will probably faint the second a real bullet flies. Keep me alive until the chopper lands and I'll marry you. Do not let me die on this dirt.
The air in the concrete ruins of the Sector 4 war zone usually tastes like ash and spent brass, but for Caleb Wright, it tastes like unearned resentment. As a civilian contractor medic, he is an outsider in a world of rigid steel and battle-hardened hearts, none harder than Commander Lena Holtz. To her, Caleb is a soft liability, a man who belongs in a sterile clinic rather than the bloody chaos of urban combat. Lena has spent her entire career building a fortress around her emotions, believing that survival is reserved for those who treat their hearts like weapons. She looks at Caleb's kind eyes and steady hands and sees only weakness, never imagining that those very hands would one day be the only thing standing between her and the abyss. But destiny has a way of shattering the strongest armor. In the shadow of crumbling skyscrapers, a single moment of violence will strip away Lena's authority and force her to put her life and her future into the hands of the man she once despised. The heavy humidity of the urban war zone hung thick over the forward operating base, mixing with the smell of diesel and dry dust. Caleb Wright adjusted the strap of his medical pack, his youthful face contrasting sharply with the scarred concrete of the command center. He stood patiently as the unit briefing wound down, urgents in the ruins. Caleb knew he was an outsider, a civilian contractor brought in for his specialized trauma skills. But he didn't expect the air to turn cold the moment he stepped forward. Commander Lena Holt didn't even look up from the tactical map at first, her fingers tracing a jagged line through the city's red zone. She was a woman carved from flint, her black hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her already lethal gaze. When she finally acknowledged Caleb, her eyes raked over his clean tactical gear and unblemished skin with visceral disgust. She didn't see a lifesaver, she saw a liability who had never tasted the metallic tang of a real firefight. The silence in the room stretched thin, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thud of mortar fire echoing from the city's skeletal skyline.
"So, this is the miracle worker they sent me," Lena said, her voice dropping to a low, mocking rasp that carried across the room. She stood up straight, her tall frame casting a shadow over Caleb's medical kit, her hand resting habitually on the grip of her sidearm. "I asked for a combat-hardened medic, and instead, I get a boy who looks like he's lost on his way to a university lecture." A few soldiers in the back of the room let out muffled snickers, sensing the predator in their commander locking on to easy prey. Caleb didn't flinch. His bright eyes remained steady, even as his pulse quickened under the weight of her concentrated hostility.
Lena walked a slow circle around him, her boots clicking sharply against the grit-covered floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. "Tell me, Wright, do you even know what a sucking chest wound looks like when it's screaming in your face?" she asked, leaning in close enough for him to smell the bitter coffee and gunpowder on her breath. She didn't wait for an answer, her lip curling into a sneer that dismissed his years of intensive trauma training in a single breath. To her, the civilian world was a place of soft edges and safety, a place that couldn't possibly produce someone capable of standing in the fire with her. "I've spent 3 years in emergency rotors and trauma wards, Commander," Caleb replied, his voice calm but infused with a quiet, underlying strength. The blood looks the same, regardless of who is pulling the trigger. It was the wrong thing to a woman who viewed the battlefield as a sacred, brutal proving ground. Lena laughed, a dry and humorless sound that cut through the room like a blade, making the other soldiers shift uncomfortably. She stepped back, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe the audacity of the man standing before her.
"You're nothing but a glorified Band-Aid dispenser, Wright," she spat, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. "You've got the soft hands of a man who's never had to hold someone's guts inside their body while the world is exploding around you." She reached out and flicked the medical patch on his shoulder with a contemptuous finger, her expression one of pure, unadulterated disdain. "I give it 20 minutes in the ruins before you faint at the sight of real gore and become just one more body my real soldiers have to carry."
Caleb felt the sting of the insult, but he kept his expression neutral, his hands remaining relaxed at his sides, despite the urge to defend his dignity. He understood that in her world, respect was bought with scars and paid for in shared trauma, neither of which he possessed in her eyes. "I'm here to do a job, Commander," he said simply, though the weight of her judgment felt like a physical burden on his shoulders. Lena just turned her back on him, dismissing his existence entirely as she returned her focus to the map, her posture radiating a cold, impenetrable arrogance.
"If we're forced to take him, put him in the rear of the second Humvee," Lena ordered her sergeant, her voice devoid of any further interest in Caleb. "Keep him out of the way, and make sure he doesn't trip over his own feet when things get loud." As the soldiers began to file out of the room, Caleb caught the pitying looks from some and the hard, mocking stares from others. He looked down at his medical bag, the one thing he trusted in this world of iron and ego, wondering if he would ever find a way to pierce the armor of the woman who already considered him a ghost. If the mission went south, would he be able to prove he was more than just a boy in a vest? The convoy ground its way through the skeletal remains of the city, the Humvees bouncing over shattered asphalt and piles of rusted rebar. Caleb sat in the back of the second vehicle, his hands resting on his medical kit, feeling the heavy vibration of the engine through his boots. Outside the armored glass, the urban landscape was a graveyard of gray concrete and scorched brick, silent and predatory. Lena sat in the lead vehicle, her silhouette visible through the dust, a symbol of rigid authority that refused to acknowledge the outsider trailing behind her. The air inside the cabin was thick with the nervous energy of soldiers who knew that in these ruins, every window was a potential barrel.
Suddenly, the world dissolved into a cacophony of thunder and jagged light as a roadside IED detonated beneath the lead Humvee. The shockwave slammed into Caleb's chest, rattling his teeth, followed immediately by the rhythmic, terrifying chatter of heavy machine gun fire from the surrounding rooftops. Caleb grabbed his bag, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his training took over, dampening the fear into a cold, sharp focus. He scanned the chaos, searching for the olive drab uniform of the woman who had so thoroughly dismissed him.
"Commander's hit. We've got a casualty in the kill zone," a voice screamed over the radio. The sound distorted my static in panic. Caleb looked toward the lead vehicle and saw Lena collapsed near the passenger door, her body partially shielded by the frame but exposed to the plunging fire from the buildings. She was trying to crawl toward a concrete barrier, but her movements were jerky and weak, her face a mask of sudden, agonizing shock. The shrapnel had shredded her right thigh, and even from 20 yards away, Caleb could see the dark, pulsing fountain of blood that signaled a catastrophic arterial breach. The soldiers around him were pinned down, suppressed by a relentless crossfire that chewed up the pavement and sent concrete chips flying like shrapnel. "Don't move, Wright, you'll get your head blown off," a sergeant barked, grabbing Caleb's shoulder as he prepared to lunge toward the commander. Caleb looked at the sergeant, then at Lena, who was now clutching her leg with trembling hands, her face turning a ghostly, translucent white. He knew that the femoral artery gave a person less than 3 minutes before the heart stopped, and the medics and the other squads were nowhere to be seen. If he stayed behind the armored plating, she would be dead before the air support arrived. With a surge of adrenaline that blurred the edges of his vision, Caleb wrenched himself free from the sergeant's grip and threw himself into the open street. Bullets whistled past his ears, snapping through the air with the sound of cracking whips, but he didn't slow down. He slid across the gritty asphalt, his knees burning as he collided with the side of the damaged Humvee right next to Lena. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy, the fire of her arrogance replaced by the dull, terrifying haze of impending shock. She tried to speak, but only a soft, wet cough escaped her lips as she sank further into the gray dust. "I've got you, Commander. Just stay with me," Caleb grunted, his hands already moving with a practiced, mechanical speed that ignored the chaos around them.
He ripped open his trauma shears and sliced through her heavy fatigues, revealing a jagged, deep wound that was pouring her life out into the ruins. The sight of the gore was worse than anything he'd seen in a civilian ER, but he didn't faint. He didn't even blink. He jammed his thumb into the pressure point at her hip, feeling the hot, slick reality of her blood coating his skin, his eyes locked on the wound as he fought to stem the tide. Lena's breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps, her head lolling back against the hot metal of the vehicle. She looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw the Band-Aid dispenser working with a ferocity and precision she had never attributed to anyone outside her elite circle. The sounds of the battle seemed to recede into a dull roar, leaving only the sound of Caleb's heavy breathing and the metallic click of his medical instruments. Her hands, once so steady on a rifle, were now fluttering uselessly at her sides as her blood pressure began to plummet, stealing her strength and her pride in one fell swoop.
"The extraction miles away," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap at any second. She looked down at the pool of red spreading beneath her, then back up at Caleb's soot-stained face, realizing for the first time that her life was entirely in the hands of the man she had mocked. The environment was closing in, the shadows of the ruins lengthening as the enemy pushed closer, sensing the weakness of the unit's leader. Caleb tightened the tourniquet with a grimace of effort, his eyes meeting hers with a silent promise that he wasn't going to let the abyss take her. Not today. The shadows of the bombed-out cathedral offered a cold, hollow sanctuary as the squad dragged Lena's fading body into the nave. Outside, the world was a cacophony of whistling mortars and the staccato rhythm of urban warfare. But inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of ancient dust and fresh copper. Caleb worked with a frantic, focused energy, his hands slick with the blood he was desperately trying to keep inside Lena's veins. She was shivering now, a violent tremor that rattled her bones as her body entered the late stages of hemorrhagic shock. The arrogance that had defined her just hours ago had been stripped away, leaving behind a woman who looked smaller, more fragile, and hauntingly human.
"Hold the light steady," Caleb barked at a nearby corporal, his voice carrying a command authority that none of the soldiers dared to question anymore. He was elbow-deep in the reality of her trauma, his fingers dancing through the mess of shredded muscle and bone to find the nicked artery. Lena's eyes were fixed on the vaulted ceiling, her pupils dilated until they were nearly all black, reflecting the flickering orange glow of fires burning in the streets. Every time a blast shook the ground, dust rained down from the rafters like gray snow, settling on her pale, sweaty skin. She tried to lift her head, her hand grasping weakly at Caleb's forearm, her fingernails digging into his skin as if trying to anchor herself to the living. I can't feel my legs," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant roar of the battle. It was the first time she had used his name, and the sound of it sent a jolt through him, more powerful than the adrenaline. The commander was gone. There was only Lena, a terrified person facing the cold reality of her own mortality in a place that didn't care if she lived or died. Caleb leaned over her, his face inches from hers, his steady gaze acting as a lifeline for her wandering focus. He could see the terror behind her eyes, the sheer visceral panic of a warrior who had lost control of her own body. The corporal's hand shook, causing the flashlight to dance across the blood-soaked floor, and for a moment, the gravity of their situation settled over the group like a shroud. They were miles from the extraction point, and the radio was nothing but a hiss of static and broken reports of enemy movement closing in. The unit's medic supplies were running dangerously low, and Caleb knew that without a transfusion, Lena's heart would simply stop from the lack of volume. He looked at the empty fluid bags and the rising tide of red on the floor, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had the skill to fix the wound, but he couldn't create blood out of thin air. Lena's grip on his arm tightened for a brief second before her hand fell limp, sliding off his sleeve and hitting the stone floor with a dull thud. Her head lolled to the side, her breathing becoming a series of short, wet hitches that signaled the final stages of respiratory failure. "Lena, stay with me! Look at me!" Caleb shouted, slapping her cheek gently to pull her back from the edge of the darkness. Her eyes flickered open, but they were distant, the light in them fading like a dying ember in a cold wind. The soldiers around them bowed their heads, the weight of impending loss pressing down on the small circle of light.
Is she gone?" the corporal asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that mirrored the scene. Caleb didn't answer. He was too busy checking her carotid pulse, finding only a thread-like, irregular beat that threatened to vanish at any moment. He looked around the ruins of the church, searching for a miracle in the rubble, but found only the cold indifference of the war. He knew what he had to do, a procedure so risky and desperate that it was forbidden in almost every medical manual, yet it was the only option left. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a reminder of the life he still possessed and the life he was about to gamble.
The environment seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the two of them, the medic and the commander, locked in a silent battle against the inevitable. Caleb reached into his pack and pulled out the manual transfusion kit, the plastic tubing coiling like a snake in his hands. He looked at Lena's face, seeing the woman who had called him a coward, and felt nothing but a fierce protective need to see her eyes burn with fire once again. He wasn't just a Band-Aid dispenser. He was the only bridge she had left to the world of the living, and he was prepared to burn himself down to keep that bridge standing. "Don't you dare close your eyes," Caleb muttered, his voice thick with emotion as he prepped his own arm for the needle. Lena's eyelids fluttered one last time, her lips moving without sound as she slipped further into the gray haze of unconsciousness. The squad watched in stunned silence as the civilian they had mocked prepared to give the ultimate gift, a sacrifice of flesh and fluid in the heart of a wasteland. As the first drop of blood entered the tube, Caleb felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, a harbinger of the physical toll he was about to endure. Would his blood be enough to fuel the heart of the woman who had never believed in him? The air in the cathedral grew colder as Caleb connected the line from his own vein to Lena's, the clear plastic tubing quickly filling with a deep, pulsing crimson. He felt the initial sting of the needle, then a strange, hollow sensation as his own life force began to drain away to replenish hers. Lena lay deathly still, her skin the color of parched bone. But as his blood entered her system, a faint, erratic rhythm returned to her pulse. The corporal watched in a daze, holding the light steady as Caleb's face began to lose its color, the medic's hands trembling slightly as he maintained the flow. Outside, the sounds of the enemy grew louder, the clatter of boots on rubble signaling that the insurgents were searching the rooms room by room. "You're going into shock yourself, right?" the corporal whispered, reaching out to steady Caleb as the medic slumped against a stone pillar. Caleb ignored the warning, his eyes fixed on Lena's face, watching for the slightest sign of returning life. He knew the risks of an incompatible or direct transfusion in the field. The potential for a fatal reaction was high, but she had no time for tests or cross-matching. He was a universal donor, a lucky coincidence of biology that he was now betting both their lives on. Each beat of his heart felt like a heavy mallet striking his chest, his vision beginning to fray at the edges into a vignette of gray shadows and flickering light. Lena's eyes suddenly snapped open, unfocused and wild, as the influx of volume jump-started her failing consciousness. She gasped, a jagged, rattling sound that tore through the silence of the church, her hand flying up to Caleb's collar. Her fingers were weak, but her grip was desperate, as if she were drowning and he was the only solid thing in an ocean of black. She looked at the tube connecting their arms, the realization of what he was doing hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The man she had called a coward was literally bleeding himself dry to keep her heart beating in the middle of a slaughterhouse. "Why?" she croaked, her voice a broken rasp that barely carried the weight of the question. Tears welled in her eyes, carving clean tracks through the soot and dried blood on her cheeks, her aggressive facade finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He was fighting to keep his own head from dropping, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers, the bond between them now forged in the most literal sense possible. "Because you're not dying on this dirt, Commander," he managed to say, his voice thick with a resolve that transcended his physical weakness.
The sound of an explosion nearby rocked the cathedral, sending a shower of glass from the rose window raining down like diamonds. Lena's eyes locked onto Caleb's with a sudden, fierce clarity, born of absolute desperation and a shifting soul. She felt the warmth of his blood spreading through her chest, a heat that contrasted with the cold void she had been slipping into. She realized then that her strength had always been a shield against the world, while his was a gift given to it. The weight of her past insults felt like lead in her stomach, a shame so profound it hurt worse than the shrapnel in her leg.
"Caleb, look at me," she whispered, her voice gaining a tiny shred of strength as she pulled him slightly closer. She could see his eyes losing their luster, the light of his spirit dimming as he pushed his body past the breaking point for her sake. The sound of the rescue chopper finally echoed in the distance, a low, rhythmic thumping that promised a way out of the nightmare. But Lena knew they were still minutes away, and Caleb was teetering on the edge of hypovolemic collapse. She reached up, her hand cupping his face, her thumb brushing over his pale, sweat-slicked skin, with a tenderness she didn't know she possessed. "Listen to me," Lena said, her eyes burning with a sudden, wild intensity as she felt the world beginning to tilt for both of them. "Keep me alive until the chopper lands, and I'll marry you. Do not let me die on this dirt, Caleb." It was a vow born of terror, gratitude, and a sudden, overwhelming realization that she couldn't imagine a world where this man didn't exist. Caleb's lips parted in a ghost of a smile, his head lolling forward until it rested hers, their breaths mingling in the dusty air. He didn't have the strength to speak, but he tightened the clamp on the tube, ensuring every last drop went where it was needed. The roar of the medevac chopper drowned out the sound of the enemy fire as it descended into the courtyard, the downwash blowing dust through the open doors. Caleb felt the hands of the rescue team pulling him away, the needle being retracted from his arm as he finally slipped into the dark. He heard Lena screaming his name, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that had nothing to do with her wounds. As the world turned to black, his last thought was of her hand in his, and the impossible promise she had made in the shadow of the ruins. Would he live long enough to see the woman who hated him become the woman who loved him? The rhythmic, sterile beep of the ICU monitor was the first thing Caleb heard, a stark contrast to the chaotic thunder of the war zone he had left behind. His body felt heavy, as if pinned to the bed by the sheer weight of his exhaustion, and a cold IV line snaked into his arm to replace what he had given away. The white ceiling was blurry, but as his vision cleared, he realized the silence wasn't absolute. There was the soft sound of breathing beside him. He turned his head slowly, feeling the pull of bandages across his chest and arms, and found Lena Holt sitting in a wheelchair by his bedside. She wasn't the Iron Commander he remembered. She was dressed in a simple hospital gown, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a soft, steady light he had never seen before. Lena didn't speak at first, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twisting nervously, a rare display of agitation from a woman who had once faced down insurgents without blinking. The arrogance that had served as her armor was gone, replaced by a raw, quiet humility that made her look younger, more approachable. She watched the monitor, tracking the steady rhythm of Caleb's heart, the very heart that had nearly stopped to keep hers beating. The news of Caleb's sacrifice had spread through the unit like wildfire, silencing every soldier who had once mocked the Band-Aid dispenser for his civilian roots. They knew now that while they were trained to take lives, Caleb possessed the far more dangerous courage required to give his own.
"You're awake," Lena whispered, her voice cracking slightly as she reached out to touch the edge of his mattress, hesitating as if she feared he might break. Caleb tried to smile, though his lips were parched, his eyes searching hers for the anger or disdain he had grown so used to. He found none. Instead, there was a profound, shimmering gratitude that seemed to fill the small hospital room. "I told you I wouldn't let you die on that dirt," he rasped, his voice a dry echo of the resolve he had shown in the cathedral. Lena let out a shaky breath that sounded like a sob, her head bowing as she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of his unwavering kindness.
The silence that followed wasn't heavy with tension, but with the weight of things unsaid, and apologies that felt too small for the debt she owed. Lena looked down at her bandaged leg, a permanent reminder of the day she had been humbled by the man she underestimated most. She realized that her strength had been a lie, a shell built to keep people out, while Caleb's weakness was actually a well of resilience she could barely comprehend. She had spent her life leading men to Dal, but she had never been led by someone as selfless as the medic who had treated her blood as his own. The environment of the hospital, with its white walls and soft lights, felt like a sanctuary where they could finally be honest. "They told me you went into hypovolemic shock before the chopper even cleared the ruins," Lena said, her voice growing stronger as she looked him directly in the eyes. "The doctors said you shouldn't have survived the flight, that you pushed your body past the point of no return." She reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a small metallic object that glinted under the fluorescent lights. Her own dog tags, the ultimate symbol of her identity and career. She held them out to him, her hand trembling just enough to show the depth of her emotion. To a soldier, handing over their tags was an act of total surrender, a sign that their life now belonged to another.
"I made a promise in that church, Caleb, and I'm a woman who keeps her word," she continued, her gaze never wavering from his. She didn't offer a traditional romantic speech. She spoke with the directness of a commander making the most important tactical decision of her life. "You saved more than just my life that day. You saved my soul from the person I was becoming." She placed the dog tags in his palm, her fingers closing over his with a warmth that traveled straight to his heart. The marriage promise she had made in the dirt wasn't a product of delirium, but a recognition of the only man she had ever truly respected.
Caleb looked down at the tags, the metal cool against his skin, then back up at the woman who had once viewed him as a liability. He saw the tears finally spilling over her lashes, the vulnerability she had fought so hard to hide, now laid bare for him to see. He didn't care about the silent insulters or the rank she held. He only cared about the woman who was finally choosing to be seen. He squeezed her hand, his strength returning in a slow, golden wave, and pulled her hand to his lips. The war was still happening outside those hospital walls, but in this room, a different kind of victory had been won, a triumph of dignity over pride.
"I'm holding you to that promise, Lena," Caleb whispered, his eyes bright with the promise of a future they had both nearly lost. Lena leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, the two of them anchored together, just as they had been by the plastic tubing in the ruins. The ICU beeped on, a steady, domestic rhythm that signaled the start of a long recovery, but neither of them was afraid of the road ahead. They had survived the fire and the blood, and in the ashes of the urban war zone, they had found a love that was as indestructible as the metal of her tags. The Band-Aid dispenser had finally healed the one heart that everyone thought was made of stone.